Hello, my name is Christopher Ewesdell Kinman, and I want to welcome you to our third primary interview in our exploration of communal practices. I introduce you today to a wonderful soul and a good friend. His name is Gene Combs, and he is from Evanston, Illinois, USA. Gene is a physician and a psychiatrist who has a passion for what he calls, quoting Gary Snyder, the real work. Gene articulates clearly how such real work or communal work is severely challenged in this day and age because of the constraints of what he calls neoliberalism. He is able to clearly mark the influence of neoliberal ideas upon the field of psychiatry and other human service professions, going back to the Regan Thatcher years. This also involves the rise of pharmaceutical companies and the corporatizing of psychotherapy and counselling. He sees the challenge going directly to the heart of community, and that everyone is supposed, within the neoliberal agenda, not only to be an individual, but also to be a corporation of one, a wise consumer who is subject to the competitions of the marketplace. This, of course, has led to devastating consequences to any sense of communal values. So, Gene's call to us is to find ways, amidst these troubling neoliberal times, to find room for each other, to break down the hierarchies that neoliberalism demands, and to find ways to go on together. I see Gene as a particularly humble man, even self-effacing at times. However, don't let that minimize the importance of what he has to say. Gene speaks carefully and slowly, lovingly choosing the best words for the moment. And he lives life with a powerful value for care. Welcome to Dr. Gene Combs. It's my honor to be in conversation with Gene Combs today from Evanston, Illinois. Physician, a psychiatrist, and as he said, a psychiatrist who's happiest when he's mistaken as a social worker. I think that says a lot. And I first met Gene, I think, the first meeting was in 2012 at an event I helped organize. And we've been connected on Facebook ever since. And he's a person who I admire. And he's a person who has something to say and has sensitivities to the idea of what we're calling in this series communal practices. So welcome, Gene.
And thank you. Thank you.
I thought we would begin, and I mentioned this before. You were quite moved by the conversation with Ward, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what touched you, what moved you about that conversation.
There was a genuineness, whatever that means. I think I said to you in responding to it that it was what I thought Gary Snyder might refer to as the real work, which has always been it's been a collection of essays that I think that's the title of. And I've always been an admirer of Gary Snyder's life and work. And partly because of his connection with Wendell Berry. I grew up in Kentucky and had the privilege of not ever having a personal conversation with Wendell, but having several friends who were close friends of Wendell, and kind of moving in that circle 40 years ago when he was younger, and being attracted to the way Wendell walks his talk. And that groundedness, and that the devoting a life to living in a certain place with his fingers in the soil, you know? And I think Gary Snyder did the same thing and turned it into poetry.
There we go.
And there was something about your friend's work that, something about his manner that reminded me physically of Gary Snyder.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he just, there was no bullshit there, just no bullshit.
No.
You know, chain smoking, drinking coffee.
Yeah.
And more holy than the person in the most religious regalia you could ever see. It seemed to me. I mean, I think Jesus would have liked him.
I tend to think so too.
You know, I don't know. That was it just kept coming back to me. God, I tell myself, and I think this is actually a fantasy that obviously it's a fantasy, it's not the life I lived, but I'd like to think that if I were a little bit braver and a little bit wiser in my 20s, I would have chosen a path that would lead me to be doing the work that he's doing rather than the work I've done with my life. I have a huge admiration for people who are in the trenches working. I'll mention Vicki Reynolds here.
Yes, Vicki. Yeah.
Who is a touchstone for me with her passion and the way she's in the streets when she's in the streets. I told you before this interview, I tend to ramble and I go on and on. So
rambling's good.
Okay.
We don't have an arrow of direction here.
Okay.
I have a few ideas, but we're going to go where it goes.
All right.
And I appreciate the ramble, and I'm almost seeing this conversation around that title of the real work.
Yeah.
So what is the real work? And I know that's a many-dimensional question, but I'm just interested where you go.
Dignity is a word I come back to a lot these days. Maybe because I'm a inveterate Bob Dylan fan, and there's a Bob Dylan song called Dignity, but I don't think it has to do with that. There's a way that people in the helping professions, which I've always moved through. That's been my education and my calling. Although I think the profession is, I would profess to be wanting to help, but I would not want to profess to being a professional about it.
Lovely distinction.
But there's something about how when the helping goes wrong, there's a paternalism or a power imbalance or just being off the mark a bit that deprives people of their dignity.
Doesn't it, though?
Somewhere at the heart of the real work, when you ask me that question, I think the real work is for all of us to be helping each other in ways that are dignified, that allow everyone involved, all creatures involved, their measure of dignity. I don't even know if that makes any sense.
Oh, completely makes sense. I don't want to interrupt you. Keep going.
Yeah. No, that ramble is going to go off into the stratosphere somewhere, and I won't even understand.
Ramble. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I'm not worried about that at all.
All right.
I keep thinking of what that country song about a rambling man. And I'm thinking that's a good thing. So let's ramble. Let's see where we go.
In my little narrative therapy jargon world, we talk a lot about linking lives through shared purposes. I think so much of what I would consider any success I've had at following whatever calling I've had in my life has been resisting individualism, resisting isolation, resisting the thingification of the universe. Trying, ever since I read Gregory Bateson, I've been trying to learn how to perceive the universe as flow, as connection, as constant becoming and interrelationship and interdependence. And it's so hard given the education I got, given the indoctrination, the training, the discipline. I guess Foucault would say the discipline that I was subjected to. And I'm still not very good at it. But it's my cosmology, is that we're all connected, we're all part of whatever deity is. It's just everything. It's all everything. How can we each do our part of the dance? Cleanest, purest, smoothest, pass on the energy that comes our way. And put our little twist on it. That's the little twist, that's the right little twist, that our place in the whole scheme of it wants us to be doing at that moment. Does that make any sense at all?
Completely. I'm trying not to interrupt you because I'm loving it.
Yeah.
And I want you to flow like that. It's important. We started with dignity, then resisting individualism, and resisting the thingification. When I think of that, I also think of its relation to capitalism, which is dependent upon turning things into things and then into commodities, And so, to me, the work you're describing has a certain political overtone to it. And an overtone I think that is very reminiscent of the Beat Poets and the early Bob Dylan. I do. I think there's something there. Colin Sanders is going to love this.
Yeah.
Maybe we could think for a minute and think of dignity and resisting individualism, resisting the thingification of the universe. And maybe you could tell me some stories about your practice, about where you encountered the resonance of dignity or the resisting of individualism or thingification.
Well, in a second, I'm going to go autobiographical here.
Please.
I'll just tell you a little history as it relates to this, but I want to acknowledge Kiwi Tamasese. Who's I'm holding over she seems to be over my right shoulder here somehow. Do you know Kiwi or who Kiwi is? Is that a name that's familiar to you? Yeah. So she's a genuine Samoan royalty, but she's also a member of the Just Therapy team, and I don't know, for whatever reasons, she's a person I carry with me that represents a certain fierceness in the defense of dignity. I don't want to displease Kiwi, so it helps me to have her over my shoulder. I fear the wrath. I fear the righteous wrath of Kiwi.
Yes.
And I trust it to keep me on track. I kind of found myself in medical school in the late 60s. Well, when did I start medical school? I was in medical school 68 to 72, I think. I almost flunked out of I didn't almost flunk out. It's hard to flunk out of medical school. It's hard to get in, but it's hard to flunk out once you get in. But I did have to take biochemistry over because of all the time I spent protesting the Vietnam War when a lot of my classmates were studying biochemistry. And I always felt like an outsider in medical school. I felt like an outsider most of my life. But toward the end of my time in medical school, with that kind of protest political consciousness being raised for a rural white Southern boy, you couldn't be in the anti-war movement without being connected to its roots in the anti-racism movement and in the civil rights movement. So a theme through my whole life since it got awakened in the Vietnam protests has been an activism identity. At its worst, I'm a social justice warrior. At its best, I'm an armchair. I don't know. I don't know. So there's that. But I was in med school, and as I went into a psychiatric residency, and I went into that because in those days, psychiatry had not yet become a totally owned subsidiary of the pharmaceutical industry. And
Yeah.
you could still learn psychotherapy, and mostly it was the place I could hang out and talk with people most.
Wow.
As a professional. It was the place where I could claim an hour, and it was okay to spend an hour with one person talking to them. All the rest of medicine, you got 10 minutes.
Yes, yes.
And so I think that's really why I chose to do a psychiatric residency, is I knew I could have longer conversations with people there. And there, a couple of my most important mentors were social workers who were family therapists, identified with family therapy. And in those days, the late 60s, early 70s, family therapy was where all the ferment was in talking, helping, psychotherapy kind of professions. It's where you would get lots of people from different disciplines who were interested in complexity and in non-individualism-based approaches to health more broadly. And those were just exciting conferences that you'd go to if you went to a family therapy conference back then. And then in my first year of psychiatric residency, I got sent to a community mental health center. Remember well, you weren't in the States. In the States, community mental health centers were these things that were supposed to be wonderful. It was when everybody was being discharged from the big hospitals, and now we're going to let people come into communities, and we're going to give them all of the psychosocial community supports that they need to make it in the community. And for about a year and a half or 2 years in the Johnson administration, there actually was promise there. And Lexington, Kentucky, where I was, had a community mental health center. I was the first psychiatric resident that went there on a rotation. They had not the faintest idea what to do with me. So they kind of made it be known that they would be happiest if I would just go back to the break room every day when I showed up and not get in people's way. Well, it just so happens that I had read a review in the Whole Earth catalog of this book called Steps to an Ecology of Mind. I think it's possible that I would not have read Steps to an Ecology of Mind had I not been at that mental health center with a bunch of time on my hands. Because Bateson's kind of hard to get into for a country boy like me, you know? But I started reading Gregory Bateson, and by the time I was a third of the way into the book, I was thinking, I don't really understand this, but it's important. And I can remember saying to myself at many times, when I'm an old man, I want to be thinking like Gregory Bateson. I want to be perceiving the universe in the way Gregory Bateson does. So that's been an important part of my life path. That seriously, I mean, that my cosmology flipped.
And it's interesting because you are thinking that way now.
Yes, yeah, I think I kind of think that way now. I think it's still hard to break out of you know, I'm in the West. I get pulled back into Western traditions all the time. But
those ideas for you, my sense is they're very, very important.
But it's been a stream through my whole life. Now, here's the other thread. Is my career as an MD, as a psychiatrist, pretty precisely happens over the time that neoliberalism develops.
Yes, right.
Regan and Thatcher came to power while I was still in my psychiatric residency.
Yeah.
And those beautifully conceptualized community mental health centers that there was some funding for originally, under the influence of neoliberalism, got cut and cut and cut and cut and cut over the succeeding 40 years.
Yeah.
And that's evil.
Thank you.
We can, I'm a fairly deep student of neoliberalism too, and we can go on lots of rabbit holes about that, but I will just say that
if you want to go on a rabbit hole down that, I'll go with you.
Well, it's just the way, the incredible political power that those ideas have come to have and still now have, and that we are in the grips of politically, worldwide, I would argue at this point, under global late stage capitalism.
Yeah.
And we're going to be lucky if some remnant of us gets through this. But I don't like to give into that kind of pessimism. But the way we have each been coerced into conceptualizing ourselves as corporations of one.
Yes.
In competition with every other corporation of one, with the greatest good being the accumulation of financial wealth. But that's had direct effects on my ability and the ability of my colleagues in medicine, if we're coming back to me as an MD, to do care. You could still take some time with people. You could still really commune with other people and have a care team around somebody 40 years ago when I started practicing medicine. There was space and time and a possibility of just doing that as you moved through your workday. What I've seen happen is I've worked to train young physicians, I've worked in hospital settings, is the steady corporatization of everything.
Yeah.
And so except it's kind of ironic to me that what happens if you look at what were the popular management practices in the previous decade in the auto industry or some such other industry, and then you look at what's happening in medicine in any current time, they're 10 years behind in the corporatization. But the practices that were very popular and are becoming outmoded in the auto industry are being taken up by medicine as medicine becomes more and more and more corporatized. So your average doctor these days is an assembly line worker.
Yeah.
And they're getting managed to move product through the system, period. And you get dinged if you start caring about a person. If you take a little longer putting that nut on that part as it goes past you. And it happens to psychotherapists who are working in about the only kind of job that a therapist can get fresh out of graduate school, which is for some large practice. The remnants of these community mental health centers that were idealized have now become little factories that are moving product through the system. And a lot of that product is also drugs.
That's what I was thinking.
And the other thing that's happened over the course of my career, pretty much contemporaneous with my career as a psychiatrist, is the growing influence of the pharmaceutical industry. And it's taken over both the day-to-day practice of psychiatry and the academic side of psychiatry, because of the way academia has been taken over by neoliberalism. The only way you get promoted within academia is by bringing in money to your department. The way you get money is to get some corporation to fund your research. The corporations that were willing to fund psychiatric research were the pharmaceutical industry.
And then we call it evidence-based.
Did I say evil a while ago? And I have huge respect for the scientific method.
Absolutely.
And I have nothing but contempt for scientism. You were talking about religion earlier, and the religion of scientism. So how can you falsify a hypothesis if your job depends on a result that's predetermined? And if you don't get that result, you don't get your grant funded next year. And if you don't get your grant funded next year, you don't get tenure, or you don't even get to keep your non-tenured job.
Completely.
But don't get me started.
I think it's too late. I think that cat's out of the bag.
So all of those things have come together over my career, and I've watched them evolve. And the thing that's kept me the kind of semi-sane that I am is seeing myself as a subversive agent in these systems and trying to look for that. Over my years as a mentor to young family physicians, I always felt like I could reach a third of any given class fairly well, and like they got me, and like I could nurture that. And there was another third that I probably had some influence on, and there was another third that was just unreachable, and we're so caught up in the system that it wasn't going to happen. But focusing on those and trying to help people find ways to spend 2 more minutes with somebody at their bedside, or when somebody came in and sat down and said, I'm sad, to ask a question like, well, why are you sad? Rather than say, have you thought about killing yourself? Which is what they're taught.
Yes, completely.
They're taught the minute you hear any evidence of sadness, that means depression, and the thing you got to do to cover your ass and keep the corporation from getting sued is do a suicide assessment and document that you did it.
Yeah.
The other thing that it kept me sane in that job, I was always conceptualizing it as my day job. That I was doing so that my partner in all things, Jill Friedman, could develop and teach the stuff that gets called narrative therapy that we do. And I think narrative therapy means a lot of things to a lot of people, and there's lots of branches of it these days. And my mentor, Michael White, was always sort of against giving it a name, even.
Good for him.
But it's, I mean, really what we're trying to teach is close listening and figuring out how to experience other people's experience. And help them give voice to that and help them attend to pieces of that experience that they have not been given permission to attend to, and help them value those parts so that their lives are fuller and more connected. So knowing that I was making it possible for Jill to spend more time doing that and being able to spend a lot of my time, and she could keep me grounded and we could work together on those projects outside of what was happening in medicine is the other thing that kept me working. And, you know, it is a capitalist system we live in. And if you're going to survive, you need a certain amount of what that system values, which is money. Well, I think any thoughtful person that's living in this society must have to think about that a lot. It was what I could do with my skills to help us move together with what's always been a shared project. I think that monster machine that's the healthcare delivery system in the United States these days needs people inside it working to dismantle it.
Yeah.
And working to offer meaningful critique thereof. And if you're not kind of in it, you don't understand enough of it to begin to try to dismantle it a little bit.
I feel a sense of almost heartbreak at what's happening in the system and how it's affecting patients and professionals. And
I wouldn't say it's almost heartbreak for me. I mean, it's been, you know, I am a physician, whether I want to be or not. I mean, I have that training. And it's been a real struggle not to just fall into cynicism about it all. And again, folks like you and Jill and Michael White and Kiwi Tamasese, staying connected to those purposes and that larger community of people, and knowing that when I'm in the fiery furnace, I'm representing a whole larger community that when I'm aware that I'm doing that and embodying that, there's no cynicism whatsoever. There's a clear purpose. It's just that it gets hard to stay really centered in that all the time.
And I'm going to ask a question that you've probably already done in this conversation, but I just think it's worthwhile to explore it. Tell me about this larger community. Tell me the beings that inhabit it, and tell me the conflicts that they deal with. Tell me can you articulate some of that?
Well, it shifts. It shifts, and some of it's people I know really well and have shared lots of hugs with and lots of food with, and long evenings over, probably drinking a little too much with, and some of it's totally virtual, but still very meaningful to me. Currently in my virtual community, just for an example, are these people whose work centers around prison industrial complex abolitionism.
Nice.
I've been really inspired by actually by a couple of webinars I've been to, and some online talks from Miriam Kaba. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And Dean Spade. They embody a kind of incredible idealism, wanting to imagine a world where it's not based on punishment. And yet approaching that ideal in just the most grounded and small step and patient and kind and communitarian sort of ways. Just as I listen to any of those people I just named, and there's lots of other people. So that on one end of the spectrum, there's those people I've discovered, and I would be honored if they would consider me part of their community, and they're certainly part of mine. Whether they want
in your view, they're part of that cloud, cloud community,
right? And then there's other, there's you, and I really value the fact that we've started to enrich this connection. And
me too.
You're connected to people that I'm not quite connected to, but the ramifications are there.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I never knew about these Kava and Wilson Gilmore and Spade. So
yeah, well, I recommend you check them out. So, but let's see, on the other end of the spectrum, there's Jill, who's my partner in all things. Yeah. There's the narrative therapy community, and there's our little pod of people that have hung with us through the years as we've taught this stuff that we call narrative therapy. And because we've been able to travel a lot and been invited, there are people I'm very close to in Australia and New Zealand, because that's where these ideas have taken root. And I begin to be reluctant to name names because I'll leave a lot of people out. I don't. But there's a thriving community.
Yeah,
of people there. We've taught in China for 10 or 12 years now, and made close connections there. And the richness of trying to figure out how to communicate with people who speak a language that's incredibly different than the language you speak, and how to get meaning across through a translator. When Jill was teaching, the first day she was teaching there, and they found out she was Jewish, the whole room, she says, sighed.
Mm.
And then there was this conversation about, oh, you have so much to teach us.
Mm.
You're from a people who suffered genocide, and we're still trying to learn how to deal with our genocide. To which Jill says, I'm 2 generations removed from that, and my direct immediate family didn't suffer any loss in the Holocaust. So I'm not sure I've got anything to share. They're making more of my Jewishness than I usually do. I'm a very secular Jew, you know, but this gets back to community. What she did with that was she went home that evening and she wrote to every one of her Jewish therapist friends she could think of. It said, I'm teaching in Rwanda, and they want to know about the Jewish experience of how to deal with genocide. Do you have stories you can share? Do you have wisdom you can share? And she was inundated with stories from people.
My old interest in the rhizome comes alive there. It was
yeah. Yep. And the having been exposed to that body of ideas about shared wisdom and community, so that it was kind of in her bones to do that. And to pass it along, and then when she got the stories, to share them back. And then to share back the stories she was getting from the Rwandans about how that knowledge was received and what difference it made, and to send that back to her Jewish friends. And the ripples just keep rippling, and that's when this work gets really rewarding, and one feels like one's had a little bit of influence in the world.
You know, in academia, one of the, people kept coming up with these postmodern and post this. One of the new posts out right now, an intriguing one, is what they call post-human, sometimes post-humanist. And as we are talking, you were watched over by a lizard, and there's eggs.
Yeah.
Connected to Michael White, it's connected to Australia and all of that.
Connected to indigenous communities he worked with there.
Yeah. So a whole realm comes to life. I'm wondering, in this communal space, I'm imagining this cloud. Lynn used to talk about clouds a lot. If there's a post-human element to it, if it's beyond just human, and if there's place, if there's creatures or living things or rivers or lakes or I don't know what, I'm just wanting to open that door.
Well, there's lots of places I could go with that. I think of my time with the Just Therapy folks, and the way through them I was exposed to traditional Maori and Pacific Island cultures.
Mm.
And the way that, if you go to do anything with a Maori community, you'll spend the first half of the time that's allotted just getting to know each other's land, each other's river, each other's mountain, each other's ancestry back as far as it can be traced, each other's songs. And there'll be just a deep sharing of that but before any other stuff would be considered, before you would consider it possible to pursue anything else. And that's always been it's not a part of my tradition, and I can't co-opt that, and have it be meaningful in the way it is to a Maori person. But I can, this is going to be weird now, because I was a Boy Scout in Eastern Kentucky. And as a Boy Scout, I was a member of the Order of the Arrow, which is cultural appropriation in capital letters. And it takes a, it's sort of like the honor society of the Boy Scouts. And you dress up in Indian garb, and you have these initiation ceremonies, and you spend a night in the woods alone. And but that was meaningful to me at that time, even though it was, when I look back on it, horrible cultural appropriation. It also was, I had experiences there camping in the woods. And I had experiences with my scoutmaster, who was a wonderful man, H.L. Rogers, selfless, and just loved sharing wisdom of how to get along with each other and how to be a good person. Also how to build a campfire, and that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of my connection to nature, to animals, to trees, comes from all the time as a young person I spent in the fields and the woods. And that all connects with very heady stuff I've read over the last 3 or 4 years by eco-feminist writers who are drawing on indigenous traditions and indigenous knowledge, as a corrective to how we've destroyed the environment, and to how we're just living disconnected, individualist, non-communitarian lives. And there's a lot of stuff there to be absorbed. So I can't even remember the question you asked me now, but it was something about nature and beyond human. And
Yeah.
That all just connects right back to reading Bateson
Yeah.
in 1970 or whenever it was, and wanting to learn to perceive my connection to everything else as I would have been so turned off with organized religion that I wouldn't have wanted to call it holy back then, but I think I could call it holy now.
Yeah.
Did any of that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. I lived for a few years in southwestern Michigan and in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
which is your part of the world, really. I mean, it's the same kind of environment.
Yep.
And I found an affinity there with the trees and in the forests. So as you're describing this, it's like I could see myself there, and I could see myself in those forests. Not in the western forest, but in those forests.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, for instance, in the springtime, when the warblers are passing through, and we would go there, and they would just be all over the place. And the eastern part of Turtle Island is profuse with different warblers, and I would go look for them. And so you're describing this connection to place, which I can connect to.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
I realize we probably need to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Thank you.
And thank you.
It's good to talk about stuff you care about and feel like it's being heard.
Mm. You have a beautiful voice and beautiful things to say, and so I want to put that thank you back to you, and thank Jill as well. She was part of this, even though she wasn't here, and I want
absolutely. And if that doesn't show, that's I mean, we're one. I mean, we're.
Well, she clearly was present, and I want to thank her. I don't think I've met her, so
we're going to have to arrange that. We're going to have to.
Yeah, we will.
See that happens.
Yeah. So thank her for me.
I will.
Thank her for her presence, even though she wasn't formally present here.
I will.
Thank you for talking about the real work.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this communal vision, which I see as this cloud inhabited by all these beings and places and ideas and all of that. It was very moving to me and deeply appreciated. And it's been very healing for me in the most real way.
Yeah.
And thank you.